That was not cool. What we just saw was not cool.
Yeah, that was an example of selfish behavior, not selfish gene, which is the focus of this video.
Exactly. So selfish gene can perpetuate itself as a selfish behavior through individuals or selfless behavior. Now, the important thing for the selfish gene is to be passed on to the next generation, and it's not a factor whether the individual is harmed through the process or benefits from the trait that the selfish gene is trying to pass on.
So I really don't like selfish people like that guy in the video, but does that mean that he has a selfish gene?
No, you see, it's not a single gene that encodes for selfish behavior. It's more like the selfish gene, uses the individual as a vehicle to be passed on to the next generation, to ensure its success is being passed on to the next generation.
So now that we know a little bit about the selfish gene, we're gonna go live now to Henry, who will explain the difference between the selfish behavior and selfish gene.
Oh, hey there, I didn't see you there. So I'm guessing you want me to talk about the selfish gene now. So the selfish gene was a term coined by Richard Dawkins, an evolutionary biologist who wrote a book by the same name. In his book, Richard Dawkins states that evolution occurs when the frequency of alleles increases due to the propagation of their phenotypical traits. According to Dawkins, the selfish gene is a gene that is not necessarily selfish or has any motives or desires. Its effects can be metaphorically described as if it were. Alright, so in terms of male insect mating, males that inherit the selfish gene of self-sacrifice have a greater chance of increasing their paternity in contrast to those who don't. I love cricket balagnings. We're not sponsored by them though. So I'm going to talk about another example of the selfish gene theory. So, have you ever heard of lions and you know how they have their big prize and stuff? So, basically on a genetic level, they are genetically related, right? So, it makes more sense that they help each other out so their genes are propagating, you know? Alright, so let's think about it. The selfish gene doesn't necessarily confer a phenotype or behavior that is harmful or advantageous to the individual. All the gene cares about is being passed on to the next generation. So it doesn't really matter if the holder of the selfish gene protects his own siblings, his offspring, or his siblings' offspring, because they all have the same genetic material. They all share 50% of the same selfish gene material. So our next example involves a species of fish with 3 individuals, a gamma fish, an alpha fish, and a female. So the alpha fish has phenotypical traits that allow him to be sexually selected for by the female, while the gamma fish, in contrast, has no sexually selected traits that don't allow him to be selected for. So he has to try something else in order to pass on his genes, right? So he has a selfish gene which confers his behavior that allows him to hitch on a ride with the alpha. So when the alpha is about to fertilize a female with his sperm, the gamma fish also releases his eggs or his sperm at the same time. So what this does is it allows some of the eggs to be fertilized by the gamma, allowing his genes that were conferred by the selfish gene to be passed on to the next generation.
Thank you, Henry, for that informative piece that you prepared for us. Now we're going to go to Ikra, where she'll talk to us about
Selfish behavior.
Thank you.
Selfish genes often accompany selfish behavior, but this doesn't necessarily mean that all selfish behaviors observed in animals are accompanied by selfish genes. An example of selfish behavior can be seen in mountain chickadees. Unlike most food-caching animals who live in groups and share their food, these chickadees tend to hide their food as far away and out of sight as possible. When presented with a familiar observer from the same group and an unfamiliar observer from an outside group, food-caching sites were chosen that were out of sight of the observers. When presented with no observers, the food-caching sites were used equally, showing that chickadees present selfish behavior in the selection for food-caching sites, so they don't have to share their food with anyone. Another example can be seen in adult penguins. These penguins have shown selfish actions in their natural habitat. Sometimes an individual is involuntarily pushed off from a cliff into the cold waters of Antarctica, as the other observe if it is safe or not for the chosen penguin. If the water doesn't seem too dangerous, the other penguins jump off the cliff and into the water.
Yo, you guys think this is safe to walk on?
I don't know. Is it?
Looks like it. Woo! It's good.
Lastly, let's talk about the biggest jerks of all time, the wolverines. Selfish behavior is observed in these animals as they are not only known to chase away other scavengers from a carcass, but also show no shame in stealing a hard-earned kill from a small wolverine or other animals entirely. Well, that's just standard food competition, but when do they become jerks? Well, after Wolverine has eaten all the food it can, it will spray the leftover with its musky scent. In summary, the wolverines have stuffed their stomachs as much as they can, and then they try to spoil the food so other predators and scavengers cannot eat it, making it not about competition, but actually having more than what others have.
Just in case.
Thank you, Ikra. That definitely clarifies the difference between selfish gene and selfish behavior. And so, in conclusion,
Hold on. Just before we finish, I have one more question. You know that video we saw in the beginning?
yes.
Was that an example of selfish behavior or selfish gene?
How about we let them answer this question? At the beginning, we saw a male order a drink for a female. Another man swoops in, is that a word? Swoops in and takes credit for the drink. You guys think that was selfish gene or selfish behavior? If it was selfish behavior, how could it be considered a selfish gene? In conclusion, we'd like to touch up on the 3 types of selfish gene that we discussed, or Henry discussed with us. One, where the individual gets harmed in the process of gene getting passed on. 2, the individual is indifferent, doesn't get affected, the gene still gets passed on. Or 3, where the individual actually benefits from the process and the gene gets passed on. All 3 cases, we see that the gene, being selfish gene, gets passed on to the next generation, no matter the type of behavior showcased by the individual.
Thank you for watching, and I hope that was informative and you learned something new today.